Herod thought he could defy God and go unpunished.
But the Bible describes his death in a shocking, painful, and humiliating way.
What happened to his body in his final days
Is so disturbing
that many avoid speaking of this terrifying end.
Before continuing, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and stay until the end, because the details that follow are almost never explained in this way. Thus was the death of Herod. The terrible end. The Bible describes in detail, year 4 before Christ. In a palace in Jericho, one of the most powerful men of the ancient world rots alive. His body exhales a smell that drives away even the most loyal servants. Worms consume his flesh while he still breathes. Herod the Great, builder of cities, reformer of the temple, murderer of wives and sons, is dying in a way that no physician can halt. The king who tried to kill the Messiah now cannot control even his own bowels. This is the story of how the most feared man in Judea ended his days, and nothing you are about to hear is an exaggeration. To understand the fall of Herod, one must understand his rise. He was not born to be king. He had not a drop of royal blood in his veins. His father, Antipater, was an Idumean, a descendant of the Edomites, a people whom the Israelites considered enemies since the times of Esau and Jacob. In the lineage that mattered to the Jews, Herod was a foreigner. He did not descend from David. He did not belong to the priestly families. In the eyes of the people he would one day govern, he was an intruder with ambition. But Rome did not care about sacred lineages. Rome needed order. Judea lay in a strategic position between Egypt and Syria, cut by trade routes that moved fortunes. The territory seethed with religious tensions, constant revolts, and bloody disputes for power. The Romans wanted someone local enough to understand the culture, but pragmatic enough never to place Jewish interests above the interests of the empire. Herod was that man. In 37 before Christ, something extraordinary happened. The Roman Senate, gathered in solemn assembly, declared Herod king of Judea. He was about 36 years old. The title came before the territory. Herod still needed to militarily conquer the region they now called his. He was king of a land he did not control. This did not last long. With the support of 2 Roman legions, about 10,000 professional soldiers, Herod marched upon Judea. City after city fell. When he arrived, at Jerusalem the siege lasted 5 months, 5 months of hunger, of death, of desperate resistance. When the walls finally gave way, the bloodbath was so intense that Herod himself had to ask the Roman soldiers to stop killing. Not out of pity, out of strategy. He did not want to rule a graveyard. The former king, Antigonus, was captured alive. By order of Mark Antony, he was beheaded, the first Jewish king to suffer this humiliation in all history. Herod finally sat on the throne. But sitting did not mean being accepted. The Jewish people never embraced Herod as legitimate. To them, he was a usurper supported by pagans, an Idumean ruling the land promised to Abraham, a man who owed his throne to Rome, not to God. The tension was constant, silent, and deadly. Herod knew that his survival depended on 2 pillars, the favor of Rome and the absolute fear of any internal opposition. He cultivated both with obsession. On the Roman side, Herod was an impeccable ally. He financed games in honor of Caesar. He built temples dedicated to Roman gods in cities outside Judea. He sent tributes so generous they impressed even the wealthiest. Senators. He visited Rome personally to reaffirm loyalty, bringing gifts that cost fortunes. When power changed hands, when Augustus defeated Mark Antony and became the sole master of Rome, Herod was quick to change sides. He met with Augustus, confessed he had been loyal to the defeated enemy, and swore he would be equally loyal to the new emperor. Augustus believed him. More than that, he liked Herod. The Idumean was useful, efficient, and never created problems. Rome had dozens of client kings scattered across the empire, but few as reliable as the king of Judea. Augustus expanded his territory more than once. Herod repaid every favor with more constructions, more tributes, more demonstrations of submission. On the internal side, the strategy was different. terror. Herod maintained a network of spies that infiltrated all levels of Jewish society. Markets, synagogues, banquets, even private family gatherings, anywhere people conversed, there were ears loyal to the king. Any suspicion of conspiracy resulted in imprisonment. Any rumor of disloyalty ended in execution. There were no public trials, no appeals, no mercy. Fear was as efficient as any army. But the terror did not stop at external enemies. Herod killed his own family with the same coldness with which he eliminated political rivals. His favorite wife, Mariamne, was the granddaughter of the last legitimate king of the Hasmonean line, the family that had ruled Judea before the arrival of the Romans. The marriage was political. By uniting with her, Herod tried to lend legitimacy to his own throne. But he also loved her, according to ancient accounts, intensely, possessively, and sickly so. Jealousy and paranoia were stronger than love. When rumors began to circulate, rumors that Mariamne might be conspiring against him, rumors that she had been unfaithful, Herod did not investigate. He did not converse. He gave no chance for defense. He ordered a show trial and the death sentence. Mariamne was executed around the year 29 before Christ. She was less than 30 years old. Ancient historians state that Herod never recovered. He ordered the death of the woman he loved and spent years lamenting her absence. He screamed her name in the palace corridors. He ordered servants to call for her as if she were still alive. He plunged into depression, fell ill, almost died. Some historians believe he went temporarily mad with grief. But the grief did not stop him from continuing to kill. Aristobulus, Mariamne's brother, was the next. He had been named high priest, the most important religious office in Israel. He was only 17 years old and was loved by the people. During a party in Jericho, Aristobulus entered a pool to cool off. Herod's guards entered with him. They held the youth under water. When they pulled him out, he was dead. Accidental drowning, said the official report. No one believed it. Alexandra, mother of Mariamne and Aristobulus, was executed later. She had tried to conspire against Herod after the death of her children. Or at least that is what the spies reported. Truth or lie, the result was the same. Mariamne's entire family was eliminated. The two sons Herod had with her, Alexander and Aristobulus, named in memory of the dead relatives, grew up under constant suspicion. Herod sent them to Rome to be educated, hoping distance would calm his own doubts. The young men returned years later, refined, cultured, popular. And this made everything worse. Herod saw in his own sons the shadow of the wife he killed. He saw in them heirs of a lineage he destroyed. He saw threats. Rumors of conspiracy began almost immediately. Herod hesitated for years. He consulted Augustus personally on what to do. The emperor tried to mediate, tried to calm, tried to avoid more blood. It did not work. In 7 before Christ, Herod ordered the execution of both sons. Alexander and Aristobulus were strangled in Sebasti, the city Herod himself had rebuilt and dedicated to the emperor. The father killed the sons in the place he built to honor Rome. The phrase attributed to Augustus spread through the empire. It is better to be Herod's pig than his son. The irony was cruel. As a nominal Jew, Herod did not eat pork. His pigs were safer than his heirs. But one was still missing. Antipater was Herod's eldest son, born of his first marriage. With the death of Alexander and Aristobulus, he became the principal heir, and immediately began to conspire to hasten his own ascension. Herod's spies discovered that Antipater planned to poison his father. Letters were intercepted. Witnesses confessed under torture. The heir was arrested and tried in the presence of a Roman representative. Herod still hesitated. Perhaps he wanted to believe that at least one son was loyal. Perhaps he no longer had the strength for another execution. His body was already failing. The disease was advancing. Antipater remained imprisoned while his father rotted slowly. 5 days before dying, Herod finally gave the order. Antipater was executed. 3 sons dead by direct order of the father. A beloved wife transformed into a victim. A mother-in-law eliminated. A brother-in-law drowned. The throne Herod protected with so much blood would remain in the hands of sons he barely knew, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, born of later marriages, raised far from the center of power. But before dying, Herod would still have one last act of cruelty, and this time the victim would not be his family. When Jesus is born, the Gospel of Matthew presents Herod as already old, sick, and seized by fear. The paranoia that accompanied him his entire life now consumed every thought. He saw threats everywhere, and then news arrived at the palace that turned paranoia into terror. Magi coming from the east appeared in Jerusalem. They were wise men, likely from Persia or Babylon. Men who studied the stars and interpreted celestial signs. They asked a simple question that echoed through the city markets. "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him." King of the Jews. The news came to Herod like a death sentence. He was already King of the Jews. Rome had declared him king. If another king had been born, it could only mean one thing. Someone would come to take his throne. It did not matter that it was a baby. It did not matter that the threat would take decades to materialize. Herod had spent his life eliminating threats before they grew. This one would be no different. He summoned the chief priests and scribes of the people, men who knew the scriptures better than anyone. He asked a direct question: where was the Christ to be born? The answer came immediately, citing the prophet Micah. "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, and thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah. For out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel." Bethlehem, less than 10 kilometers from Jerusalem. Herod called the Magi in secret. He did not want the city to know of his interest. He asked exactly when the star had appeared, thus calculating the maximum age of the child. Then, with all the falsehood that decades of politics had refined, he asked the Magi to go to Bethlehem, find the boy, and return to inform him. "That I may come and worship him also," he said. It was a lie. The Magi departed. They found the house where Jesus was with Mary. They offered extraordinary gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, gifts worthy of a king. But when they prepared to return to Jerusalem, they were warned in a dream, "Do not return to Herod," and they obeyed. They departed for their own country another way, disappearing into the desert routes. Herod waited. Days passed. The Magi did not return. The king's fury was absolute. He did not know which child was the threat. He did not know exactly where he was. He had no face, no name, no address. So he made the decision that would seal his reputation forever. If he could not kill the right king, he would kill them all. The order was sent to Bethlehem and its surroundings. All boys of 2 years old and under were to be executed. The age limit was calculated based on what the Magi had revealed. The star had appeared approximately 2 years prior. Any child who could be the born king was within this interval. None would be spared. The soldiers arrived at night. Bethlehem was a small village. Historians estimate there were between 10 and 30 boys in the determined age group. It was not a large number by the standards of ancient atrocities, but horror is not measured only in statistics. Imagine a mother waking up to the noise of soldiers at the door. Imagine a father trying to protect his son and being thrown against the wall. Imagine the weeping that spread through the narrow streets of that village, a weeping that lasted the entire night and echoed for generations. The Gospel of Matthew cites the prophet Jeremiah to describe the scene. "In Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not. The massacre of the innocents. That is the name history gave to that night. Children torn from their mother's arms, families shattered forever, all to protect the throne of a king who was already dying. Because while the soldiers carried out his orders in Bethlehem, Herod's body continued its relentless deterioration. Joseph, adoptive father of Jesus, had received a warning in a dream before the massacre. Flee to Egypt with the child and his mother, for Herod seeks to kill him. The family departed in the middle of the night, crossing the desert toward the only place where the king of Judea had no power. Jesus survived. The boy Herod wanted to eliminate escaped without anyone knowing. The massacre was in vain, and now the disease exacted its final price. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote decades after Herod's death, left a detailed account of the king's last months. The descriptions are so explicit that modern doctors still try to diagnose exactly what killed him. Theories include chronic kidney failure, Fournier's gangrene, severe diabetes with complications, or a combination of several diseases. The symptoms were terrifying. Constant fever that yielded to no treatment, unbearable itching over the entire surface of the skin, so intense that Herod scratched himself until he bled. Painful swelling in the feet, so severe he could barely walk. Inflammation in the colon causing continuous abdominal pain, increasing difficulty breathing as if his lungs were filling with fluid. And then, the worst. His genitals began to rot. Gangrene set in, producing a constant purulent discharge. Inside the decaying flesh, worms began to form. Larvae that fed on the still living body of the king. The smell was unbearable. Doctors had difficulty approaching to examine him. The closest servants had to take turns because no one could stand to stay in the same room for long. The most powerful king of Judea, the builder of cities and temples, the man who made Rome respect his name, was being devoured from the inside out. Herod tried everything. He traveled to the thermal springs of Calero on the other side of the Dead Sea. The hot waters were famous for their healing properties. Kings and the wealthy from all over the East went there in search of relief for their ailments. The doctors hoped the baths would help reduce the fever, soothe the itching, cleanse the wounds. It did not work. They then tried a more aggressive treatment, immersing the entire body in warm oil. The idea was to hydrate the skin, relieve discomfort, perhaps suffocate the parasites. The treatment almost killed him. Herod fainted inside the oil. His eyes rolled back. The doctors screamed. The servants panicked. For a moment, everyone thought the king had died. They managed to revive him. But it was clear to everyone, there was no cure. Herod was going to die. The only question was when, and he knew it. The king's mind, sharpened by decades of conspiracies and betrayals, still functioned even as his body failed, and this mind produced one last plan, perhaps the most macabre of his entire life. Herod knew the Jewish people did not love him. He knew his death would be received with relief, perhaps even with celebration. The idea that no one would mourn his funeral was unbearable to his pride. So he decided to ensure there would be mourning one way or another. He summoned Jewish leaders from all regions of the country to come to Jericho. They were the most important families of every city, respected men, patriarchs, public figures. When they arrived expecting some royal announcement, they were all arrested. Herod ordered them locked in the city hippodrome. Then he called his sister Salome and his brother-in-law Alexis. He gave them a clear instruction. The moment he died, all prisoners were to be executed immediately, all of them, without exception. The logic was simple and terrible. If the people would not weep for the death of the king, they would weep for the death of their leaders. If there was no genuine mourning, there would be forced mourning. Herod wanted tears at his funeral, even if they were tears of pain for other losses, even if they were tears of hatred. The plan was not carried out. Salome released all the prisoners as soon as Herod died, perhaps out of humanity, perhaps out of fear of the revolt the massacre would cause, perhaps simply because, with the king dead, there was no longer any reason to obey his insane orders. But the order itself reveals the final state of Herod's mind, a man so consumed by the need for control that he wanted to dictate even the emotions at his own funeral. A king who spent his entire life forcing the world to bow to his will and who could not accept that death would deprive him of that force. In the last days, the pain became so unbearable that Herod tried to kill himself. He asked for an apple and a knife to peel it, a seemingly innocent request. But when the knife reached his hands, he turned it against his own chest. A cousin who was in the room screamed. Guards came running in. The knife was wrestled away before he could complete the act. The king of Judea had no control even over his own death. Herod died in Jericho in his winter palace a few days later. He was about 70 years old. He governed Judea for 37 of them. He built more than any king before him, Caesarea Maritima, Masada, Herodium, the Temple of Jerusalem in all its glory. He killed more than most tyrants: wives, sons, brothers-in-law, mothers-in-law, priests, rivals, and dozens of innocent children in Bethlehem. He died eaten by worms, stinking of rotten flesh, surrounded by doctors who could not help him, and servants who could barely stand his presence. The Bible interprets this death as divine judgment. In Acts chapter 12, describing the end of another Herod, Agrippa, grandson of the Great, the text is explicit, "And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost." The pattern repeats in the biblical narrative. Kings who exalt themselves against God end up humiliated in their own bodies. The power that defied heaven comes undone in the flesh. Herod's body was transported in an elaborate procession to Herodium, the mountain fortress he had built to be his tomb. The cortege traveled about 35 kilometers through the Judean desert. The army marched in front. 500 slaves carried aromatic spices, frankincense, myrrh, expensive perfumes, to disguise the smell of decomposition. The body was covered by a purple robe, the color reserved for kings. A golden crown shone upon his head. Everything had been planned by Herod himself before dying. He choreographed every detail of his own funeral: the order of the troops, the quantity of slaves, the type of spices, the exact route. Even in death, Herod tried to control the narrative. He wanted to be remembered as grandiose, majestic, eternal. It did not work. His kingdom was divided among 3 surviving sons before the body cooled. Archelaus got Judea and Samaria. Herod Antipas received Galilee and Perea. Philip inherited territories to the north near Syria. None of them received the title of king. Rome downgraded them to tetrarchs and ethnarchs, lesser rulers, directly subordinate to the emperor. The empire Herod spent his life building was sliced into pieces. Archelaus was so brutal and incompetent that the Jews themselves asked Rome to remove him. 10 years after Herod's death, his principal heir was deposed and exiled to Gaul. Judea came to be governed directly by Roman prefects. The most famous of them would be Pontius Pilate. Herod Antipas appears in the Gospels. It was he who ordered the beheading of John the Baptist. It was he who interrogated Jesus before the crucifixion. He ended up exiled, accused of conspiring against Rome. Philip was the only one who died in peace decades later, leaving no heirs. Herod's dynasty faded out in 1 generation. The temple he rebuilt lasted a little longer. For 70 years after his death, the sanctuary remained standing, the most impressive building in the entire Jewish world. Pilgrims came from all parts of the empire to admire its monumental stones, its gigantic columns, its gleaming gold. In 70 after Christ, Roman legions besieged Jerusalem. The Jewish revolt had begun 4 years earlier, and Rome decided to crush it definitively. The siege lasted months. Hunger inside the walls killed thousands. When the soldiers finally entered, the temple was set on fire. The stones Herod had placed, some weighing more than 500 tons, were thrown down one by one. Jesus had prophesied exactly this: "There shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Of Herod's monumental constructions, only the Western Wall survived. To this day, Jews from all over the world go to that wall to pray. It is all that remains of the temple Herod rebuilt, a retaining wall, a fragment. Herodium was excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century. They found the remains of the palace, the baths, the gardens, the cisterns. In 2007, an Israeli team announced the discovery of what would be Herod's tomb, a reddish stone sarcophagus decorated with sculpted rosettes. It was broken into dozens of pieces. Historians believe it was intentionally destroyed by Jewish rebels during the Great Revolt against Rome. Even 60 years after his death, the hatred for Herod was still strong enough for someone to take the trouble to climb that mountain and shatter his coffin. Not even the bones were found. While all this was happening, while the kingdom was divided, while the sons failed, while the temple burned, while the tomb was desecrated, a child grew in silence. Jesus returned from Egypt after Herod's death, according to Matthew's account. An angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and said it was safe to return, for they are dead, which sought the young child's life. The family did not return to Bethlehem. They did not return to Judea, where Archelaus now ruled with the same brutality as his father. They went to the north, to Galilee, and settled in a village called Nazareth. The boy Herod tried to kill lived. He grew up as a carpenter's son. He learned to work wood with his hands. He attended the local synagogue. He memorized the scriptures. In the eyes of any observer, he was just another poor Jewish youth in a forgotten province of the empire. Herod had mobilized soldiers, spies, royal decrees. He killed innocent children to eliminate a threat to his throne, and he failed completely. The boy grew. At 30 years old, he began a public ministry that would last only 3 years. He did not command armies. He did not build palaces. He did not accumulate riches. He walked on foot along the roads of Galilee, taught in synagogues and on hillsides, healed the sick, confronted hypocritical religious men, and proclaimed the arrival of a kingdom that was not of this world. The contrast with Herod is absolute. Herod built entire cities. Caesarea Maritima took 12 years to be erected, with an artificial harbor, temples, theaters, and palaces. Jesus never had a place to lay his head. Herod commanded armies that conquered territories and crushed rebellions. Jesus gathered 12 common men, fishermen, tax collectors, unknowns, and said they would transform the world. Herod died in a luxurious palace, surrounded by doctors and servants, with a grandiose funeral planned in minute detail. Jesus died nailed to a Roman cross between 2 criminals abandoned by most of his followers. Herod was buried in an artificial mountain built especially for his tomb, with a military procession and 500 slaves carrying spices. Jesus was placed in a borrowed tomb, prepared in haste before the sunset of the Sabbath. Herod died and stayed dead. His body rotted, his bones were lost, his tomb was destroyed. Jesus died and rose again 3 days later. The irony of the divine plan runs through this entire story, like an invisible line. Herod had spies on every corner, soldiers in every city, informants in every synagogue. He had the support of Rome, the greatest military power the world had ever known. He had incalculable wealth, fortified palaces, a system of terror that silenced any opposition. And he could not kill a baby. Joseph was a carpenter without influence, without money, without an army. He fled in the middle of the night to a foreign country, carrying a newborn and protecting a young wife. He crossed the desert on foot, lived as a refugee in Egypt, returned when he received divine permission. And he won. Herod's power was visible, measurable, documented in stone and blood. Anyone in Judea could see his constructions, fear his soldiers, feel the weight of his government. The power that protected Jesus was invisible, silent, impossible to track. A dream here, a star there, a warning at the right moment. Nothing Herod's spies could intercept, nothing his soldiers could combat. The king died rotting, powerless before his own decaying flesh. The baby grew to offer eternal life to whoever believes. While Herod rotted in Jericho, surrounded by incapable doctors and terrified servants, a child grew in silence in Egypt. The king who ordered the massacre of Bethlehem could not touch that boy. The irony of the divine plan is absolute. Herod's throne was divided among weak sons and forgotten by history. The boy he tried to eliminate would become the most known name of all time. Herod's death is not just the end of a tyrant. It is the demonstration that no human power resists the purpose of God. Kings build palaces, armies, and temples, but they do not build eternity. Herod died trying to hold on to a throne that was never his. Jesus was born to offer a kingdom that will never end. The king's body turned to dust. The message of the Christ remains alive. 2,000 years later, Herod's name is remembered as a synonym for tyranny, paranoia, and cruelty. No one visits Herodium to honor his memory. They go as tourists, curious about the ruins of a megalomaniac. The name of Jesus is proclaimed on every continent, in thousands of languages, by billions of people. This was not just the death of a king, it was the public crumbling of a man who believed he could occupy the place of God, and discovered too late that not even his body obeyed him anymore. and it was the silent beginning of a kingdom that no Herod will ever be able to destroy.